Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Emerging Pod, where we guide emerging people into emerging careers. Today's guest is Gerard Cardoso. Gerard has a rich background in data science, spanning a range of companies, big, small, and everywhere in between. He spent a few years at Founders Factory, advising startup on their data strategy, whilst building his own startup, a skill deal comparison site. He is now a senior data scientist at nPlan, redefining how construction projects are planned using machine learning. Gerard, great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Did we do justice with that intro? Is there anything else you'd like to add on top of that?
No, I mean, you did it better than I could. That's pretty good.
Okay, so I suppose maybe going straight into the first question. So based on your background, it seems like you've worked on a lot of data challenges in a range of different contexts. When was the first time you realized that you can actually solve problems with data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess to go a little bit further back, so my background was in mathematics and statistics. So I was studying at the University of Bath doing that. And one of the fortunes I had, one of the best things that happened to me was being able to do a placement year while I was doing my undergraduate. So in my third year, I got to go out and work for Accenture for a year. And there I got really exposed to some projects around data. At the time, it was more around data integration and kind of, joining lots of disparate data sources that our clients had. But that's where I really got exposed to, just the sheer quantity of data that companies have, but also how much value it could provide were it all in the right place. And I was lucky enough to have some really good mentors at the time who told me about data science, machine learning, who were like, you're still young, you can go and study these things and go into this field because there's a lot of exciting things happening in the space. And that's really what sort of kicked everything off at that point. Is afterwards I went back and completed my degree and chose to specialize a bit more in statistics, which felt a little bit more practical and valuable than kind of a lot of the other areas that I was studying in the master's degree. And afterwards knew that, okay, to be useful, I probably should also look into how do you turn statistics into like insights. And at the moment we were just doing R, but actually how do you build better software, better toolkits? And so that's kind of where I went into data science and did my master's, and the rest is history from there. But like, I guess it all started really at that point where I realized that data was key while working at Accenture, and it was just really lucky that I got to spend that year out, and that kind of changed how I saw things or what I wanted to do with my career.
That makes sense. I can relate. When I did a bit of management consulting as well at a German strategy house called Roland Berger, and this was in Romania. And the first kind of few weeks were very hardcore, and there was a lot of data collection. We were working for like giant national gas companies, and they weren't necessarily the most sophisticated. So we had to do a lot of the data connection analysis for them. And that's when I realized that, oh, wow, these companies are paying hundreds of thousands, if not millions, for sometimes an intern just kind of coming in and doing some fairly basic data analysis. But that was my first kind of interaction with it. I suppose.
Yeah, I guess also you realize just the ROI on these kind of projects is insane when you think about it. Even just these simple things, or what we consider to be simple, can have crazy impact. It can change the way a business operates or thinks about kind of new revenue streams or new products. And it's at the scale of these kind of businesses, the numbers start becoming quite large.
It's very true. So did you, after doing a bit of consulting in Accenture, did you know the pathway that you wanted to get on, go back to your master's, and then did you know exactly what you wanted to do after you finish, or was it more of a
no, I guess
try things out?
Yeah, I think as a person, I'm less of a planner and more of a let's see where things go. What do I want to do right now? And that's kind of taken me along a path that, in hindsight, it's easy to connect the dots, but at the time I wouldn't have been able to tell you what I was planning. So from then on, I kind of knew I wanted to do a master's. I knew I wanted to keep going in terms of my education, but focusing on how do I apply the skills I had to business and to improve business outcomes. And so the master's I did was called Business Analytics, which had a lot of data science and machine learning concepts in it, but it was very much geared towards the application side. How do you take these skills you have, these theory, and how do you apply it to get business value? So that was kind of always geared towards using what I had to add value. And after that, I came across the first job I had because the CEO of Satalia at the time where I joined was the director of the master's I was doing. So a couple of us from the course ended up working at Satalia, and Satalia was doing some really exciting things at the time. They had a team of data scientists, people in operations research, PhDs in optimization, and software engineers. And we were solving some really challenging problems for, again, clients who were a little bit bigger, like Tesco's and PwC and these kind of clients, where it was kind of large scale optimization problems with some data science and demand forecasting and these kind of problems. And that was kind of the first real exposure into, cool, you've been doing statistics, you've been doing data science in this academic context. Everything changes when you get into the real world. And it's sort of like starting again. But having that theoretical background kind of helps when you get stuck. You kind of know what to do or what could go wrong. But you kind of have to learn everything again. And so I always see like the jump from academia to industry is always interesting because you kind of you've done a lot of projects, but everything looks quite different when you join the real world.
That's true. Actually, one of our previous guests compared academia and doing a PhD with entrepreneurship because, in effect, you don't really know exactly how to get where you want to go. You're just trying to build things and figure out things as you go. And sometimes it's actually a bit more difficult because you're a bit more constrained in academia to finding grants and navigating your way through the financing of it, whereas with startups, it might be a bit more straightforward sometimes, depending on what you work.
Yeah.
So how was that process applying for Satalia? I suppose you knew the professor that was a director there, so that made it a bit easier.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to do some part-time work while I was still doing my master's with him, and he encouraged everyone really to start thinking about how to apply what we were learning to businesses. And actually, our dissertation for our master's needed to be in industry, so we needed to partner with a business and do some research. And it wasn't so much about the originality of the research, but it was more about the application of the methods that you had been learning in your master's to solve a business problem. And so I was working already part-time with him during the master's, and then towards the end, I was considering continuing or maybe joining a startup as well, because at that time I was also kind of really interested in this like startup world and what it took to build a business from scratch. And it's very exciting, especially in London. It just feels so vibrant, the whole community here. So I was kind of weighing those up, but I was learning so much at Satalia working there because there were some really experienced data scientists and PhDs, and it just felt like I could really do a lot, and there was a lot of autonomy as well. So there's a lot of kind of freedom to learn and have ideas and implement those ideas. And so at the time, it was I think it was the right thing for me, and I learned a lot about coding, but actually coding in a team and not just in a notebook by yourself, which just kind of changes the game. And it was a really nice starting point for me.
No, that's a very good point. Coding for a university project is very different from coding in actual industry production grade. What are some examples of things that you had to learn between academia project and industry projects?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing, or a couple of things. So one is actually when you're developing data science solutions, or let's say machine learning solutions, when you're at university, it's really, you usually are doing an assignment with some data that's given to you, and you build a model, but it's very contained, right? It's contained in just that assignment that you're doing, and you're not really thinking about the longevity of the code that you're developing. It's sort of one-time use, and the readability doesn't matter so much as long as you can run it, get the results, and submit your assignment, and then it's done. And so kind of learning about how to work in a team and how to contribute to one code base as a team, and thinking about readability of your code and maintainability, and I think that's really important as a data scientist, because let's say you leave and someone else comes, your code needs to be understandable. People need to be able to pick up where you left off, and it should fit with the rest of the ecosystem. So learning about good software engineering practices was something that we weren't taught so much, but something we had to learn on the job. And I think the second thing is something a bit more data focused, is questioning a lot about where the data you're using comes from. That was a skill I think I had to learn as well on the job, because again, when I was doing my master's, you get given data sets, but you don't necessarily question so much like, where does the data come from, and what impact does that have on what I'm trying to build. It's sort of, again, very contained and isolated, whereas in the job you have to think about not only like what data you're using now to build your solution, where does it come from, what are the biases in it, or how is it collected, and are there any problems in how it was collected, but also in this in the life cycle of whatever you're building, is the data likely to change, or how do you make sure that the data that you're using to make decisions continues to be of a high quality and relevant to whatever you're building. So this ability to like question data, where it comes from, becomes much more important, I think, when you start working in the real world.
That's a very good point. In academia, usually the data you're looking at, the problem you're looking at is fairly static. Whereas we all know that in real life, in production, things change, and you need to take that into account when looking at the data. And yeah, from a software engineering practice, most code is in the lifetime of code, it's mainly read, not written. So it's very important to take that into account when writing code.
So changing gears a little bit, after this, well, actually, during your time at Satalia, you then launched your own business, the Ski comparison site. What inspired that launch? And yeah, how were those first few weeks, months into the launch?
Yeah, so I was chatting to a really good friend of mine, a guy called Connor Miller, who we were both really avid skiers, and I forget where we were, but we were discussing how much of a pain it was to get a ski holiday booked. There's like so many different parts, and it takes ages, especially when you're thinking of a group trip, where you have to make sure everyone's got the dates, like you get all the flights from wherever it's flying from, and finding accommodation could be really difficult, and then ski hire and transfer from the airports, and there's so many different parts to it. And so we kind of had this problem, but also I think part of us wanted to just experience what it was like building something on the side and kind of go through those motions and learn from it. I remember early on we said, even if this fails, which it most likely will, and it did, we have to make it a win-win situation. So if it succeeds, great, we win. But if it fails, let's make sure that we've learned a lot from it and that we win from that. And it doesn't matter whether it fails, because we'll have taken a lot from it, and it'll help us develop, and it'll help us have more knowledge going into maybe future endeavors. So at the beginning, actually, it was a great time, because we had no idea what we were going to build or how we were going to build it. We ended up speaking to some really interesting people who advised us on where to start and what to think about. And we got to speak to them because we said, we're thinking of building this idea, like we'd love to chat to you. And I think people are very receptive to helping others. And actually that was the first lesson, was that sometimes you feel a bit reticent to like reach out, and it's like, oh, maybe they're busy and they won't want to help. But actually the first learning was that people are really willing typically to help. I say most people. And we had some really great conversations, and honestly, we could have stopped at that point and it would have been a great experience having built nothing. But obviously, we wanted to keep going. And so we ended up building a first prototype. I built it because I was learning a little bit around how to build web applications as well. So that was, again, another reason why we wanted to do it, is also like an excuse for me to start learning some of this stuff. And it didn't work. It didn't satisfy what we were doing. So we went through several iterations and realized that we had built a lot without speaking to users. So we also learned about kind of thinking about users and how you do product development in the right way. We did it the wrong way, but it sort of gave us a lot of real world experience.
That's
and yeah, it was really good in that respect. In the end, we didn't manage to kick off, and the pandemic hit, and we were like, well, we're both at a stage where we were focusing on different things. So we kind of decided to leave it there. But it was an amazing experience, and what I took from it was, I always tell people, like, if you have an idea, just do it and see where it goes. And even if it doesn't go anywhere, you'll get a lot from it. I think we have a tendency sometimes to, when we have an idea, we think 100 steps ahead and try to plan for everything. And then we'll eventually say, oh, it won't work, or something will happen here, and we procrastinate, right? Whereas I think the best way is just take that first step, and you'll sort of figure it out as you go, and just make sure that whatever you're doing is you're learning from, and you're building connections, and even if it doesn't work, you're setting yourself up for success as well.
Definitely, but don't quit your day job, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I guess at the time we definitely weren't making enough from it, and we enjoyed it we both were still really into our careers and what we were doing, but it was a really nice sort of avenue to pour energy into on the side. And I think it also actually led to me finding Founders Factory, and also kind of exposing me to that world. So it had a lot of benefits. So I'm even though it failed, I'm really glad I did it.
Yeah, that's exactly how you learn. And that leads to Founders Factory. So how did you find out about Founders Factory, first of all? And then what was that like? What were the first few months in there?
Yeah, it was very serendipitous, actually. So I found out about Founders Factory through my girlfriend, who was part of a community that Founders Factory ran called Hatch. And Hatch was a community that Founders Factory used to run for people who are interested in building businesses, or maybe were building a business, to meet up and talk about, challenges, experiences, maybe hear other guest speakers. And I applied to the Hatch community because at the time I was building Ski Deal Comparison, and it felt like a place where we could learn a lot from other people. And we got accepted, and I went to an event, and I got contacted by Founders Factory at the time saying, hey, we're actually hiring for a data science coach. Is this something you'd be interested in? And it was at a time where I had been at Satalia for a few years. I felt like I had honed my skills a little bit better into how to run data science projects. I was also building this startup, and I was really interested as well into how data works in startups. So when a company is at its earliest inception, how do they get on that journey of being data driven, of using data? And the intersection sort of got me interested in what that role would be like. And so I was like, yeah, let's have a conversation, let's chat. And we had I started by chatting to the chief scientific officer at Founders Factory, a guy called Jeffrey Ng, who ended up being my boss. And we kind of really got along, and he had a lot of previous experiences, someone who I could really, learn from, and he had built his own company. So someone who's just a great person to have by your side and to kind of work alongside with. And I had maybe one of the most unconventional interviews that I've ever had afterwards, which was a role-playing interview. So in the role that as a data science coach, a lot of what I had to do was meet with businesses in the portfolio and advise them on how to take those first steps in their data journey, how to build the right foundations, and also how to think about building machine learning applications and data science solutions. And so we role played that. So we had an actual founder of a company in the portfolio who came, and we had a sort of session where he was telling me about the business, and we had to sort of role play what it would look like if I was actually meeting him. Well, I was meeting him for the first time and I was giving advice. Meanwhile, 3 other people were watching us do this. So it was very high pressure. But luckily, like I was coached through it, and I had enough sort of to share. And so I got the offer after that and was really excited to join. And I think there was a lot of businesses that Founders Factory were building that were exciting, and I could hopefully be a part of that journey.
What was the most interesting project you worked on, if you can divulge?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think probably the most interesting project I worked on was for a startup called Maneno. They're a Danish startup, and they build a reading app for children, and they sort of gamified reading to help children sort of enjoy that process more. And they wanted to build a recommender system for books. And recommender systems, I discovered while I was at Founders Factory, were by far the most used algorithms, I think, across startups, because it's very obvious how they provide value, right, in terms of suggesting products and services to users. This was an interesting case because children, obviously, as they learn to read and they grow up, their interests change a lot, and they change very rapidly. So the traditional recommender systems I got to use didn't really work very well, or they didn't work in predicting what children might want to read next. So it had to be a recommender system that incorporated this idea that children are sort of evolving quite rapidly on their reading journey, and their interests change quite a lot. And I got to research in terms of some methods there, and using more like recurrent methods that would predict, like, okay, they've read this chain of books, what's the next book that they'll read? And that was a really cool proof of concept that I got to do with them, and we got to deploy it as well. So it got to actually add value. So that was a nice, like, complete project that I managed to do at Founders Factory. And it was a really interesting one because of that nuance of children kind of interest changing.
That's really nice. Yeah, we used to work with schools as well, and just knowing the kind of impact that you have through the products that you're creating, and the fact that they're going to be used by hundreds or thousands of kids, just makes it gives you strength and motivation, I suppose, to keep going. So after working through a bunch of different, how many projects in total do you think you worked with? How many companies at Founders Factory?
I think in my time, I probably worked with over 30, but in different capacities. Some I, like Maneno, I was really involved with, and was actually building proof of concepts for them. Others was a bit more light touch, which was kind of advice on, what, how should you think about the data you collect? How should you think about storing or building your data architecture and perhaps your data strategy? And so it's a real mix of kind of involvements, but yeah, I would say over 30 in my time there.
Are there any patterns that you see in terms of skills required to build a business that leverage data products?
Yeah, I think I'd say the biggest skill, which is required, I guess, if you're like a data person in one of these startups, is to really be obsessed about building fast and learning fast. And so I think at the early stages of these businesses, this is pre product market fit, right? This is pre proving like the hypothesis of whatever they're building. You're going to be trying a lot of different things. You're going to be learning from all the experiments you run, and you're going to be changing course a lot. So it's not good to be too precious about a solution or a way of building, let's say your data architecture or whatever you're building, because it's likely that in some time that might not be relevant anymore. So having the DNA of wanting to build something that helps you run an experiment, helps you learn, and then iterating fast is a really key skill, I think, when you're early on in a startup journey. I think as the startup becomes more mature, then you want to think a bit more about, I guess, scalability and how you build things for the long term. But at the beginning, it's very much what can I build now that'll help me move on to the next stage, or help me learn something new, or help me experiment. And so a lot of the work I did with startups was thinking about what's like the minimum thing you need to build in order to move forward. And also, I think data is really valuable in those early stages to help you make decisions fast, right? So building that core analytical capability in your team. So making sure you have the right data set up, so you're measuring what's happening in the product, and you're visualizing it in a way that can help the founders or the product team to make decisions quickly. That's something as well that I kind of was working on some of these businesses with, and I think just a core thing to have when you're early on.
Yeah, that fast iteration loop is crucial for early stage startups, because you don't really know what you're building. You're just making assumptions. You need to put it out, test it, see if it works, double down. If it does, change gears. If it doesn't, that was one of the problems we had working with schools. We created project-based curriculum, and it would take a year to get feedback on what we built. So it's like, what do you do in that time? So you have to develop new things and then try them out. And eventually you start to get feedback from multiple places at the same time in a cascading kind of way. So then you try to iterate. So it was tough, especially with hardware as well. But it was
I can imagine.
It was an amazing experience.
How did you shorten the feedback cycle? Did you try anything that worked?
We tried other things. We got commissioned to create bespoke curriculum for a multi-academy trust, but then we also tried to do events in conjunction with companies, so things like workshops or boot camps or kind of national scale competitions. And then we also tested smaller projects, like projects in a box, basically a box of kit, and then access to a range of different types of projects that you can create with the kit through our platform. And that was used in STEM clubs and things like that. So the iteration cycles were a bit faster, but then the main revenue came from the curriculum. Interesting time.
Yeah, super interesting.
So that leads me into, I suppose, a final question on this. Any common mistakes that would save people a lot of time and energy? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, so I think a common mistake I see is that people have this big dream sometimes of what data is going to do for the business. And I think that's good. You should have kind of a vision of where you want to go. But sometimes we build things, or I see people approaching data in this kind of very waterfall way rather than an agile way. And what I mean by that is sometimes when I was engaging with startups who wanted to understand how data was going to impact their business, it was very much like, okay, what's all the data we need to collect, and what are then all the things that we want to do with that data, and then let's go and build all these things, and then we'll have completed our data journey, or we'll be well on our way. And I saw, it's easy to get stuck in that process. It can take months, maybe years, to kind of go through that process when you consider it as like, okay, this is all the things we want to do. We're going to build all of these things. Versus doing things in a sort of more agile way. So what I always, an exercise I always did with businesses was to think about, when you think about your data strategy, you should always have a few quick wins. And those quick wins are things that, are quick and will add value to the business immediately and will sort of get you going and get you learning. So there's a lot of value in thinking about, okay, what's the smallest thing I can build that will help me go through this loop and will already add value to the business. And in doing so, you're learning a lot about what it takes to make a data project work in a business. So it's not just about data collection and building the algorithm, but also how do you deploy an algorithm, or how do you deploy a solution? How do you evaluate that it's working or it's having the intended effect? Like, what are the metrics that you're measuring? It forces you to think about all of these things with maybe a small solution, but then everything else that you're thinking about will inevitably be faster, because you'll already be in the mindset of thinking about kind of what it takes to go end to end. So in summary, I guess it's think about how you can go end to end as fast as possible, and then kind of expand from there, rather than thinking about, all of these complicated things that you want to build and doing them in a sort of waterfall way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Really, to really focus on the success criteria and on the return on investment. That's the only way really to apply and use AI and machine learning successfully. People tend to sometimes think of it as like a magic wand that you can apply to a problem that you don't really understand, whereas actually it works a lot better if you identify a task that requires a human expert to do. Then your AI and your machine learning can learn from that human rather than just magically come up with an answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes we get lured into this world of thinking that the most complicated solution is the best one, or the solution that sounds most state of the art will be the best one. But in my experience, what I found is, if you force yourself to build a baseline, something that's really simple, perhaps doesn't even include machine learning. It just could be a rules-based system. It could be a simple model. That can sometimes already get you most of the way there. But even if it doesn't, at least you have a baseline to measure when you start going into these more complicated methods. How much better is this than the baseline? Rather than spending, months of development time building this complicated solution, only to find that a simple matching system actually, or a simple rules-based system actually works just as well. So I think that's a really good habit to have as a data scientist, is don't be lured into this world of like building what sounds the coolest. Really just try to think about, what's the simplest way I could solve this problem right now? Build it end to end, see, okay, how well does that work? Not good enough? Great. Let's think about how we can improve it. Or if it's good enough, then fantastic. Like, I can move on to the next thing until, what's the next thing I can work on, rather than spending so much time building something really complicated. And I think that helps as well. Sometimes I've seen in businesses that it's hard to sometimes prove the value of the data team, or sometimes the data teams are kind of isolated, forced to, they kind of are in their own world. not connected to the business. But the best way a data science team can work is when they're really tightly coupled with the business and they're always thinking about how they can move forward the business outcomes, or how they can improve or how they can work towards whatever the strategy of the business is.
That's very true, especially for scaling companies and for larger companies as well that are leveraging data science and machine learning. And talking about scaling companies, so you were at Founders Factory and you transitioned into nPlan, which is a fast-growing startup. When did you decide to look for your next adventure?
I think the main motivation was that I had been at Founders Factory and supporting the startups in the portfolio a lot. But to be honest, I was also always a little bit sad when we had to say goodbye to these businesses and they kept going and I saw them going on their journey and I had to work on the next one. Not that the other ones weren't exciting, but I was always like, oh, it'd be really cool to be on that journey as well, to understand what it's like to go from this early stage and then see what is it like to work at a startup that's growing, and what are the things you need to think about at the different stages. At the time, also, I think the nature of my role was that I was quite spread across many businesses, and I could never go deep into one business. And so part of me also craved that feeling of like latching onto a problem or to one business and really going deep and seeing, okay, what can I change here? How much value can I add here? And I was kind of having these thoughts, and I came across nPlan because nPlan runs a machine learning paper club every Thursday at 12:30 at lunchtime. So you can check it out on Meetup. It's a little plug there, but I came across through nPlan through the paper club, and they had some roles open, and nPlan was kind of incorporated the parts that I really care about in a business, which is it's a really challenging problem to solve. No offense to people who are in like e-commerce or retail, but like I found that a lot of data science problems, particularly in those businesses, were very same. It was always about kind of how do we sell more products or how do we reduce churn, whereas nPlan's really trying to solve a very challenging problem in the world of construction, which is around forecasting and managing risk. And so it had a really meaty problem that we're probably not going to solve. We're starting to solve, but we're not going to solve completely, maybe ever. But it's a really exciting journey to be on. And also, the second thing that I really liked about nPlan was that it had quite a mature data team. So data is really core to the business and to our products. So it wasn't an aside. And so it felt like a place where the work that we're doing in the team can have real impact and is really part of the strategy there. And so I met a few people from the team, applied to the role, and just really got along with everyone and saw that everyone was super smart, super switched on, and it was a really exciting problem. So that's why I decided to jump across.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of horror stories when it comes to businesses trying to use data science and add it to their capabilities. The main challenge seems to be the communication between the data team and the rest of the business. How does nPlan align the data team's work with the rest of the business?
I think the main way it's manifested is that we're very good at questioning everything that we're working on. And particularly in the data science team, whatever we look at, we always think, okay, is this going to add value to the product? Is this going to help our users make decisions better or do something better? Or is this going to improve perhaps the way that we think about data in the business? Is this going to improve the way like our machine learning research, is this going to provide new avenues? And so everything we work on, we're always thinking about, okay, like let's say we build this, what's our hypothesis on the value it's going to add? And so we're always making sure that we're validating that. And as well, I guess a broader thing is that we have at nPlan we use OKRs, and we set quarterly OKRs, and so we use those as well to think, okay, what can the data team do to help push those OKRs forward? So a combination, I guess, of OKRs and also looking at the product roadmap, and we kind of make decisions about what we work on based on that. But I think the core is really just everything we work on. We make sure that we have a hypothesis about what is it going to add to the business.
If I remember, at Airbnb, Riley Newman, who was the first data scientist recruited by Airbnb, and ended up leading the data science function at the business as it scaled, created this concept that data is not about numbers, data is people. And he framed the data as representing the voice of the customers. And it was very interesting because his goal was to, instead of data becoming an afterthought, so different department would come up with initiatives or hypotheses around what they want to test to help growth or problems they want to tackle, they would then think, data would be an afterthought, and they would look for data to back up their hypothesis. By changing the narrative around data and making data now the voice of the customer, he positioned it in the way that the other function would use data, would leverage the data to build their hypothesis and come up with initiatives, rather than coming to the data after the fact. How much do you think it applies to nPlan?
Yeah, so it's a little bit different to Airbnb in the sense that a lot of the data we have is not data about our users, so to speak. So we actually, as a company, we work with a relatively small number of clients compared to a B2C company. And a lot of the data we have is data on their projects. So it's less about the users and more about like the projects itself. So I guess the data team within nPlan, the way I like to think about it is that we need to be the people who are most knowledgeable about the data set that we have. And so when people have, we need to be able to sort of talk about the data set to the rest of the business, almost like educate about what we're seeing in our data set, and bring in those like best practices to all of the different teams in nPlan. So actually earlier this year, the way the data science team operated was we operated within product teams. So we have a handful of product teams, each working on a different part of the product or a different part of the business. And so we had data scientists embedded in those teams. And so they would be always kind of there advising and bringing that sort of data science capability to each of the product teams. We've since actually split out of those teams for various reasons, but that kind of what that's allowed us to do is it's allowed us to look at the business a bit more broadly and operate a little bit like an internal consulting team where we work on a project basis. So we look at what are the different teams working on, what's the plan for the next, let's say, 3 months, and where do we think we can add the most value. And so we sort of insert ourselves in different places based on that.
It makes sense. I forgot to ask, actually, how was your experience applying for the role? Was there any role play involved this time?
Not this time, no. But it was equally intense in some ways. But our process has some of the typical data science processes that you see elsewhere. So there's an assignment, there's a technical interview. But I think what nPlan does differently is we really care about our culture and our values. So we have 3 values that there's not a week that goes by where we don't talk about those values in everything that we do. And so that's part of the process is what we call a values interview. So we assess how well you will align to those values based on a series of questions, and we have a team that is constantly calibrating the questions we ask and how we measure people in that interview to make sure that everyone we're adding to the team is additive to the culture and will fit into the values. So it's kind of the technical side, the culture side, and then at the end, the final interview is a what we call an on-site. So we have a slightly longer interview, but you get to meet, by the end of the process, you get to meet a lot of the team. You get to experience what it's like to work at nPlan. And so I'd say the candidates have a really good understanding of what it is that they're joining and what it is that will be required of them, which has led to, us hiring some really good people, but also the people we hire tend to stay for quite a while, because I feel like we put a lot of effort into the hiring process to make sure that people who join understand what they're joining, what their role is, and what the potential is in terms of their role. And also we make sure that, they'll fit in well.
Quick question. What are the values? You just made me super curious.
Yeah, so the first one is aim high, run fast. So we like to say we don't go for the lowest hanging fruit. We go for the highest fruit that we can grab at this moment in time. The second is learn from everything. So we're really big on retrospectives, making sure that whatever we do, we're always learning how to get better, but also individually, we're always thinking about our own growth and development and learning from what other companies are doing, for example, or what's going on in the industry. And our third is radical truthfulness, which is based a lot off the book called Radical Candor. So it's all about, I guess, two things. One is caring deeply about others in the team, and then also challenging directly. So it's about giving feedback constantly, regularly, at the right time, in the right way. So we're always helping each other get better, always challenging people when we see things that we disagree with, but learning to have thoughtful disagreements. So those are the three values that we live by.
Final topic. You've used your experience so far to write a book. It's called Business Models in Emerging Technologies. How did the idea come about?
Yeah, so I started writing the book in 2020, so now a couple of years ago. And what motivated me to do that was that I felt like because at Founders Factory I was working in so many businesses, I had the chance to kind of refine how I worked with them and what we did and the exercises we went through. I saw what worked and what didn't work. And so I was learning a lot just through the process of working with many businesses. And part of me was like, I think this knowledge would be interesting, or I'm in a unique position to be able to share lessons about what it takes to build a data-driven startup. And it coincided at the time I met with someone called Stylianos, who's also a co-author in the book. And we both had very similar interests. And we were initially going to write a white paper or a series of blog posts. And he got reached out by an editor to ask him whether he wanted to write a book about AI, data science, emerging technologies. And he saw it as a good opportunity to combine what him and I were talking about, as well as what he was working with some other leaders in the field of blockchain. And we decided to kind of join those as a book that could help people who are non-technical, like leaders or executives in business, understand what are these technologies that have the potential to disrupt most, if not all, businesses, and how should you think about them going forwards. So it's intended to be a practical book where you learn not just about the concepts of data science and blockchain, but also about what it means for business and how you go about implementing those technologies, or what you need to be aware of. So yeah, that was the motivation behind it, was really wanting to share what I was experiencing, what I was learning, so that others could also benefit from it.
And you have a chapter where you talking about recruiting data scientists. And you talk about the different tribes of data scientists. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
When you talk about data science tribes, which part are you talking about exactly?
Yeah, I'm talking about the part where you identify 3 profiles of data scientist: computer scientist, statistician, and quant specialist. So if I remember correctly, computer scientists are essentially data scientists that have a background in computer science. Statisticians, they have a background in math, and quant specialists have a specific background, whether it's in finance, physics, or biology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's become more clear that data science as a term is confusing. So when you look at data science jobs or you look at data scientists, a lot of people are doing very different things. And actually, my thinking has evolved a little bit since then as well on that. But I actually think so. Data scientists typically have been thought of as having these skills, which are kind of analytics, statistics, and machine learning. And so a data scientist needs to be good at all of them. But sometimes I think, especially when you're early on, it's rare that you would need someone who is a generalist or is good at all of these things. Like there might be, depending on what stage you're at, you might actually need someone who's a data engineer, or you might only need a data analyst, or you might need a machine learning engineer to start working on deploying some machine learning solutions in production. And so when thinking about hiring for data roles, I think it helps to take like a skills-based approach rather than what a lot of companies do these days, which is kind of put up a data science job, which is a sort of catch-all. But really, if you start to understand, okay, where am I in the business? What's my strategy? What's my data strategy? Then you can start to think, okay, what are the skills I need to take to turn this data strategy into reality? And you'll find that, that there might be a need for data engineering, or specifically like building analytics or BI tools. And you don't need a machine learning, you don't need someone who knows machine learning. And that can help you make sure that you're hiring the right people at the right time and that you have the right set of skills in the team. So yeah, I think it's sort of a new way of thinking about how teams are built, rather than just like having a data scientist, which is a catch-all, but starting to think about these sort of more specific roles.
Yeah, and speaking to employers, we saw the same problem. 2 companies could advertise for data science roles, but the actual skills they're looking for are very different. And actually, what we've seen is the challenge for companies is if they pick a very narrow and specific job title, they're taking the risk that candidates disqualify themselves. So the approach they've been taking is this, using a generic name like data scientist for the job role, for the name of the role, and spending more time on the job description and describing the task that they expect the candidate to be able to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also helpful for whoever's applying to your job to know exactly the kind of things they'll be doing, because I think too many times I've seen data scientists be hired into a business thinking that the data will be ready and that they'll be able to, to work on some exciting problems, only to find that they actually need to build the actual infrastructure first. And that's a pretty, well, it's not in their wheelhouse. There's people who are better at doing that. It's also just a demotivating thing to do when you think you've been hired for one thing, but you're actually doing something completely different.
Yeah, there's probably nothing more soul crushing for a data scientist to get involved into a new project to then realize that they are going to spend 80% of their time doing some web scraping.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really important as well for businesses to realize at what stage they're at and what are the prerequisites that they need to be able to actually start getting onto the data science and machine learning journey.
Exactly. And a really helpful tool I found is there's a thing called a data science hierarchy of needs, which talks about this kind of stage that you will go on as a business in terms of your data journey. So at the bottom, it starts with collecting raw data, understanding, getting your data collection right. Then it's about building your pipes. So you have maybe a couple of data sources. How are you going to store this data? How are you going to merge it or transform it or combine it? And at that point, you can start to have some analytical capabilities. So you can start to look backwards at your data and start to understand patterns and trends of what's happening that can inform your decision making. But only at that point, then are you at the level where you can start to think about predictive capabilities, right? So then you start to maybe build some tools to help you maybe do A/B testing or to help you make predictions about different things that can help you make decisions. And then at the top of the data science hierarchy of needs is the sort of more complicated machine learning algorithms. But I think it's really important to understand where you're at as a business. So by acknowledging where you're at, you know what you need to invest in and not sort of jumping ahead, which it just will be much harder to do, and you'll be missing a lot of the value. You'll be missing a lot of the value capture that you can start doing earlier on if you skip to, say, just starting with machine learning from scratch.
Gerard, it's been great to have you with us. Is there anything you'd like to promote, and how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I try to be a bit more active on LinkedIn. That's probably the platform where I try to post the most. But yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always keen to chat about data strategy, about data in businesses, startups. And yeah, if you want, definitely check out the book, Business Models and Emerging Technologies, which talks about kind of some of the lessons that I learned, as well as some really interesting insights and lessons from the other co-authors. So check out that book or hit me up on LinkedIn, and I'm always keen to chat and meet people in the space.
Thanks, Gerard.
Thank you so much.